Wrestling fans tend to split up all of the chunks of time in the history of this business into eras. And everyone has their favourites. You got your Monday Night Wars, Attitude Era, Ruthless Aggression, New Generation. But everyone will pretty much agree that the absolute worst of times went down just a few years ago as a pandemic took over the globe, right? You have not been rewatching Thunderdome Classics, have you? Which brings me nicely to this intriguing question right here. What if that era many class as the absolute worst of times to be a wrestling fan, well, it never happened? Well, my answer, it's a bit long, so strap in, folks. Because I am Gareth, this is What Culture Wrestling, and here is What If Wrestling's Worst Era Never Happened. The first few months of the fateful year known as 2020 were already quite an experience within the wrestling bubble. Tetsuya Naito held both the IWGP Intercontinental and Heavyweight Championships as Wrestle Kingdom 14 concluded. NXT took over Blackpool again. A rated R superstar sensationally came back from retirement at the Royal Rumble. WWE pulverized The Fiend via Daman in Saudi Arabia. AEW produced one of the greatest pay-per-views in their history in that year's Revolution, one which boasted that Young Bucks vs Omega and Hangman showdown. And Shayna Baszler completely dominated the Elimination Chamber. Headlines were made, tears were shed for a variety of reasons, and the emergence of a real alternative in North America had pumped some much-needed energy into the business. Then the entire world just changed in March, didn't it? The global pandemic forced much of the planet to suddenly lock itself down, with this leaving the likes of WWE and AEW strangely producing their shows in front of an audience of zero. An already intensely bleak period was made that little more gloomy by the surreal visual of larger-than-life performers beating the crap out of one another inside of echoey venues, with only the sound of a few excitable commentators and bodies smacking against one another breaking up the deafening silence. Episodes were taped in chunks, the biggest show of the year went down inside of an empty warehouse, and the industry was left to navigate new COVID protocols put in place to try and ensure the safety of everyone doing their jobs in front of and behind the camera. Though it did take WWE a few months to finally introduce a full testing system, after initially just opting to temperature check their workers and have them fill in questionnaires for a time. Yeah, not a good move. It was a strange, scary, and the word of that period, unprecedented era, and one that is largely considered the absolute worst in wrestling history. Though the business did still offer a few glorious hours of escapism here and there during a terrifying time in human history, much of the content was devoid of energy. A ton of stars understandably took some time away from wrestling, and even the admirable attempts to get creative in this unexpected scenario often didn't come close to replacing the feeling of thousands roaring on at the action. COVID-19 gripping the planet ultimately altered not just the business as a whole and many of the promotions within it, it also massively affected the lives and careers of many a gifted performer, for better and for worse. So what if that dreaded virus didn't rapidly spread across continents then, and the pandemic didn't completely flip the wrestling landscape upside down throughout 2020 and a sizable chunk of 2021? Well, along with viewers likely not being exposed to odd karaoke contests, and the eventual constant hum of piped-in audience reactions, there's a strong chance one of the most spectacular stipulations of modern times wouldn't have found its way into the universe either. Without fans being present in buildings, the likes of WWE and AEW had to think outside the box, or ring in this case, to keep the folks locked within their homes engaged. In WWE's case, this resulted in a wave of cinematic and often outrageous outings. Those were somewhat inconsistent in quality though, is one way of putting it. For every thrilling and novel Firefly Funhouse or Boneyard match, there was a soul-destroying one final beat, a weird backstage tag team brawl thing, and an eye for an eye war. That's right, without this terrible era, you would not have been gifted the absolutely insane visual of Rey Mysterio's eye popping out people. And AEW also chucked in their own occasional cinematic misfire too, seen in the tooth and nail mess and forgettable elite deletion. Yep, you did not remember that until I said it, did you? But the fresh young company's unrivaled creativity during these dark times was very much on show when it came to the creation of the magnificent Stadium Stampede. The Elite and Matt Hardy and the Inner Circle produced absolute wrestling gold at Double or Nothing 2020, as the units unleashed wonderfully silly comedy, genuinely inspired barroom brawls, and utterly terrifying spots inside of TIAA Bankfield. Had it not been for the pandemic forcing such compelling innovation, the numerous brilliant Stampede follow-ups and Anarchy in the Arena spin-offs probably wouldn't have occurred. That means everything from a burning Jack Perry to the iconic sight of Eddie Kingston wandering out with murderous intentions possibly wouldn't have seen the light of day, folks. Folks all around the globe being forced to stay exactly where they were for the most part also led to the beginning of another fantastic classic AEW staple. With Jon Moxley not being able to fly over to Japan to defend the IWGP United States Championship he'd won in 2020, New Japan Pro Wrestling, who'd not allowed their fans to cheer in the early days of the pandemic as a way of trying to stop the spread, remember that? Well, they had no choice but to start a working relationship with AEW as they looked to promote a Kenta vs Mox showdown. So without this often dreadful wrestling era, those first few steps towards the Forbidden Door being royally booted down maybe wouldn't have been taken as early as they were. Mox likely would have just hopped on a plane back to Japan to put the strap on the line throughout 2020 and 2021, while New Japan continued to question whether this new American promotion were anything more than fly-by-nighters. Kenta's arrival on the Beach Break episode of Dynamite was the first of many AEW x New Japan Pro Wrestling crossovers, and that new partnership ultimately led to the creation of the Forbidden Door pay-per-view, one that has seen everything from Will Ospreay vs Kenny Omega to Jon Moxley vs Hiroshi Tanahashi dream bouts go down on it over the years. Honestly, I think it's one of my favourite pay-per-views of the year now. WWE is open to playing nicely with others today in a universe where they don't see the success of things like this important New Japan All Elite Wrestling partnership. Oh yeah, and the aforementioned Forbidden Door isn't the only massive wrestling show that was shaped by this unreal time. This year's WrestleMania would have ran at around 25 hours long were it not for the events of 2020 and 2021. Now yes, I may be pushing it a little bit there, but the point stands that WWE would have likely showed no signs of stopping their never-ending show of shows in a non-COVID world. It was the fact they realised sitting through 8 hours of agonisingly quiet WrestleMania action in one night was going to be a tough task for even the most passionate sports entertainment fan that forced them to go for the Wrestle Kingdom 14 approach of splitting WrestleMania 36 into 2 nights. And it was the reaction to those far easier to digest chunks of Mania which kicked off the new era of 2-night extravaganzas. A formula which has ensured that crowds remain hot throughout the duration of the event and not just burn out after like 4 hours, and giving the stars involved more time to shine. Oh yeah, speaking of that rather peculiar anything but grandest stage of them all in 2020, that event and others around that time being shoved into that tiny building because of the pandemic had quite the impact on many a performer's paths too. Had Drew McIntyre's big WWE Championship moment played out in front of a packed Raymond James Stadium as planned and not a crowdless PC, the Scotsman likely doesn't go on to produce some of the finest work of his career as a gloriously bitter soul, frustrated about the biggest moment of his wrestling life being ruined. Roman Reigns understandably deciding to take a step away from the business to protect his family during this volatile time also opened the door for Braun Strowman to win his first ever World Championship at WrestleMania 36. Something you have to imagine would not have been on the cards if the big dog was still booked to collide with Goldberg over the Universal Championship strap. And it was that Reigns' call to back away from the business for a spell which set the stage for one of the most important characters of the modern wrestling age to strut into the game. Rather than wrecking everyone and leaving before kicking off a bloodline saga that would fire the industry to new heights, the former Shield man is probably just continuing on as a bland, divisive, vest-wearing chosen one without the pandemic giving him the time to rethink his gimmick on the sidelines. Perhaps his cousin Jey Uso isn't given the opportunity to begin his own intriguing journey towards becoming a main event player, without Roman and his family dominating the top of the card and taking things into a more cinematic space either, as WWE shifted from the dull PC to the slight improvement that was the LED screen and Cheer.wav stuffed Thunderdome. And while that particular setting would ultimately go down as a symbol of the often soulless vibes felt when taking in a piece of sports entertainment that didn't involve stars like the Bloodline or Bayley and Sasha Banks, the same could not be said for another venue that would have never become as precious a place as it did without the time of no capacity crowds. Just a matter of months into its existence, a white-hot AEW found itself having to adapt to a situation that no one could have ever saw coming within the company's first year. Rather than understandably losing a lot of the momentum they generated from those electric first few months tearing it up though, Tony Khan and the gang continued to do all they could to leave their fans' jaws hitting the damn floor, as they eventually turned Daly's Place into their home for much of the pandemic. It was during this time when Jon Moxley truly evolved into the heart and soul of AEW as their world champ. The Elite's own saga continued to add more incredibly captivating chapters. The late great Brody Lee and the Dark Order became weekly highlights. Sting made his monumental debut. Thunder Rosa and Britt Baker beat the life out of one another. And Kenny Omega began his epic title collecting reign. And while AEW would have no doubt continued to create modern wrestling magic regardless of the location, there was just something so special and welcoming about switching on your TV to Daly's Place during this otherwise frequently distressing period. It's stating the obvious a bit, but Daly's Place doesn't become the nostalgic home of AEW without this Jacksonville era of bringing much needed smiles to beaten down faces faces, does it? Daly's Place also ended up being the backdrop of many a WWE to AEW jump during this wrestling era, and some of those jumps wouldn't have even been possible without the former company choosing to tighten their purse strings in response to COVID. Miro and the Good Brothers showing up on AEW programming down the road does not happen without WWE releasing them during the shocking cutting spree known as Black Wednesday. The same can be said of Matt Cardona too, with the former Zack Ryder's hugely successful independent scene stint probably not becoming a thing if he doesn't suffer the blessing in disguise that was that April 2020 release. Now, one thing that fans were robbed of during this dreadful spell though was the euphoric sound that typically meets one of these surprising debuts, with the likes of Matt Hardy, Brody Lee and FTR actually getting the thunderous pops their arrivals could have produced in a non-pandemic universe. And that wasn't the only thing All Elite viewers had unfairly taken away from them in the 2020 to 2021 era. A fantastic Elite versus the Inner Circle first ever Blood and Guts war was eventually scrapped due to COVID concerns, meaning the world would have probably got a chance to see Cody Rhodes gushing the red stuff inside of AEW's own war game structure if wrestling's worst ever period never happened. But as unthinkable as it may have seemed when living through what often felt like the darkest of spells for this business and life in general, the era that nobody ever wanted was actually perhaps the best thing that could have ever happened for wrestling. Let me explain. Can you remember watching those first few wrestling shows with a full live crowd in what felt like decades? Of course you can. It was a transcendent experience after a year or so of artificial, trainee, very few fan, or even no cheers. The sight and sound of actual in-the-flesh fans losing their damn minds as Jon Moxley and Eddie Kingston made their way through the Double or Nothing crowd, or John Cena made his shocking comeback at the end of Money in the Bank were enough to bring a damn tear to your eye. And this was all just the beginning of one of the hottest stints in North American professional wrestling history. CM Punk's long-awaited return to the wrestling world, Bryan Danielson, Ruby Soho and Adam Cole's all-out arrivals, Becky Lynch and Brock Lesnar's SummerSlam comebacks, and Cody Rhodes' insane WWE return at WrestleMania 38 were all ridiculously exciting moments that were only enhanced by an audience who hadn't been allowed to cheer for this madness up close for far too long. Would all of those aforementioned happenings still have produced a big old pop even if folks hadn't been stuck on their couches throughout 2020 and 2021? Yeah, no doubt. But there was just that little extra passion and love sitting in the voices of those who'd realised just how much they'd missed this live experience during the COVID era. Many of the seeds planted during what is largely considered the absolute worst time to be a wrestling fan eventually grew into the foundations of the boom period fans are currently enjoying too. Yes, they had to sit through the odd retribution or exploding barbed wire deathmatch disaster, but those hours spent connecting with the tribal chief and his Usos, a Bianca Belair growing into the true EST of WWE before our very eyes, an anxious millennial cowboy becoming properly elite, and so many more felt like time well spent by the time they were blowing the roof off of arenas all around the world. Some folks will never be able to happily revisit a wrestling period which brings with it memories of so much real-life pain, and that is absolutely fair enough. But even at the worst of times, wrestling proved that it was still capable of moments of inspired creativity, pulling you away from the harsh reality outside your door, and providing you with that little bit of hope to get you through the day. So while it is interesting to ponder what a world without this largely and understandably detested era would look like, it's also important to remember that it really wasn't all bad. Some of it either was then or at least led to something quite bloody good actually. If you've enjoyed this what if video today, then hit this other one right here. It's really good. We've got a whole series for you to go and watch now, so go and show them or me some love because I'm doing them all. So thank you very much. Bye bye.